Hi, welcome to our mid-year check-in. So today I'm going to be going through the best and worst books of every month, and we're going to start with January. So in January, I read 9 books. A lot of that was a mix of nonfiction, memoir, and a couple novels, including some books that I was finishing up from the end of 2025. But in January, one of my highest ranked reads was You Weren't Meant to Be Human by Andrew Joseph White. So that book received a 4.5-star rating. The only reason that I subtracted half a star is because the audiobook that I was listening to didn't include any trigger warnings, and I really needed some trigger warnings. It was incredibly relatable for me as a non-binary person who struggles with neurodivergency. It basically catalogs this young trans man's life as he's part of this bug cult. That's the only way I can describe it, is that it is a bug cult. And he ends up becoming pregnant by his partner, and the book surrounds his difficulties with that pregnancy and his struggles with remaining in this cult that doesn't want the best for him. I have a lot of fear and disgust surrounding being pregnant, so this book was very relatable for me. And I also really struggle with being neurodivergent in a world that's not really built for people like me. And so that was another big reason why I ended up rating this book as high as I did. As I said, I subtracted half a star because it didn't include any trigger warnings in the audiobook. That was a problem for me because there was actually there were several scenes of self-harm, and I really struggled to get through those. So that was a book that I actually started in October of 2025 and didn't finish till January because I had to take several breaks from the novel in order to get through it. The worst book that I read in January was Joy at Work by Marie Kondo. It received a 3-star rating from me. That was mostly because the book ended up being geared primarily towards people who work in an office setting. And as a teacher, a lot of the advice didn't apply to me, so I ended up skipping several chapters. I initially read it to see if it had any advice for me in terms of organization and stuff like that, but it didn't really have a ton of advice. There was one chapter about organizing your desk, and that did give me some ideas in terms of how I was going to organize my work desk, because I actually have several workspaces in my classroom that need to be organized. But there were several chapters that did not apply to me at all. One was about meetings, and there were several chapters about being a manager, and I'm not a manager, so I skipped those chapters as well. If you worked in a corporate environment, I feel like Joy at Work would be for you, but it just wasn't for me and didn't really apply to my working environment. In February, the best book that I read was Citizen Illegal. Citizen Illegal is a poetry collection about being the child of undocumented immigrants in America. I really found this collection of poetry really compelling. The only reason that it got 4 stars from me is because my rating system for poetry is different from my rating system for regular books. So although I did have a 5-star read in the month of February, I chose Citizen Illegal as the book that I wanted to prioritize here. I found that the forms of the poems were relatively similar, which is why it did receive 4 stars. I usually like to see a variety of forms when I'm reading poetry, and although I found the subject matter really compelling, I just found the forms to be not very different throughout the collection. My favorite series of poems was called Mexican Heaven, and it was about the different parts of heaven that would appeal to this narrator's Mexican family. One of them was really funny. It was about sneaking past Saint Peter, who is called Pedro in the poem. If you want to read that poem or one of those poems, I'll link it in the description below. But it was a really interesting read. And I think I read the whole thing in one night. I really enjoyed it. My worst read in February was Cultish by Amanda Montell. That book, I was really interested in it because I am interested in cults and MLMs and stuff like that, and how those organizations use language to exert control over their followers. Ultimately, I felt like cultish was a little too broad in its scope, or maybe built for somebody who has never heard of these kind of groups and contexts. I also felt like the coverage of some of the more serious topics in the book, including Jonestown and Heaven's Gate, was a little bit too sensationalized for my taste. I really felt like topics like that need to be very sensitively covered, and maybe covered a little bit more in depth to give that subject its due. So I really did not feel like the coverage of it was entirely sensitive, and it received a 2.5-star rating from me. My best read in March was actually Misery by Stephen King. I just really enjoyed it. I listened to it on a road trip and I found it really entertaining. I found the character building of the two main characters to be very compelling, especially because the setting of the novel is very isolated. And I really enjoyed my time listening to that book. The audiobook was also very well mastered, and it was very entertaining and well paced. The movie adaptation starring Kathy Bates and James Caan, I also believe is like literally the best movie adaptation that I've seen. They really do an excellent job of bringing these characters to life. I watched the film before and after reading the novel, and I really thought that it was a good exercise in learning what I like and what I don't like in a film adaptation. So that was definitely the standout read of March. My least favorite read was The Bear by William Faulkner. This is like not necessarily a book, but it's a short story that's like 120 pages long. So it's been published as a novella, and it's been published in the collection called Go Down Moses, which is his short story collection that's kind of strung together with common characters. So The Bear is basically about the tension between man versus nature in his made-up Mississippi county. And the nature in this collection is personified by this bear, this great giant bear that's evil and deadly that we definitely would not have in Mississippi. And then the group of people symbolize industrialism and development, especially industrialism and development by white people. And so this group of people have been trying to hunt down this bear for years and years and years, and they end up taming this really rabid dog to kill the bear. And while the dog is killing the bear and the dog pass away. And then the second half of this book is a conversation between the main character and I think his uncle. It's the most confusing, boring thing I've ever read, and this was my first foray into Faulkner, so I knew that I was kind of getting into some trouble in terms of actually understanding what was going on, because I've not really read any Faulkner. But this conversation, I was reading essays about this short story, and everyone kind of agrees that the second half of The Bear is almost unnecessary and needlessly confusing. The story is actually frequently published in a form that doesn't include the second half of the story. And I just feel like if you write a story and publishers decide that almost half of your story is not worth publishing or doesn't need to be included in order to understand what's going on, then we kind of need to rethink our priorities. Even if you are William Faulkner, I just kind of think that's a little extra. So I did not very much enjoy at least the second half of The Bear. I think if I had just read the first half, I would have given it 5 stars or 4.5 stars. But the second half, it really ended up being more like a 3 or a 2.5 star read for me. In April, I kind of had a moment where I read a bunch of Annie Dillard, and then I also read a bunch of really weird romances by C.M. Nascosta. So my best read was Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Dillard, which is kind of a pioneering book in its genre, which would be nature writing from a more narrative, personal essay style. The whole book is structured as like a year of her observing the area around her house at Tinker Creek in Virginia. I really enjoyed it. I read it in an audiobook format, so sometimes I found it hard to follow because you can't go back and reread. And Annie Dillard kind of does this thing where she's in one moment and then starts thinking about something else and starts writing down that rabbit hole instead of being in the moment that's happening in the narrative. And so sometimes I would get confused about where exactly we were and what exactly was going on in the story. I really feel like the whole piece kind of deserves its privileged place in the genre of nature writing. I felt like the book was incredible. I really loved it. The narrative arc of the entire story was compelling, and I really enjoyed it. So if you've never read any nature writing, I really recommend Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. And I also recommend a book that's kind of modeled after it called The Comfort of Crows by Margaret Rankle. That's also kind of a year in one specific area, but it covers Margaret Rankle's backyard. And I think that one is definitely, like, if you've never read a lot of nature writing, I would read Comfort of Crows first, and then I would read Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. The worst book of April was definitely The Moon-Blooded Breeding Clinic by C.M. Nascosta. I read 3 books by C.M. Nascosta in April, and that was The Morning Glory Milking Farm, which was the one that I enjoyed the most. And I also read To Ravish a Rogue, which I enjoyed like the middle amount. And then the last one I read was Moon-Blooded Breeding Clinic. And I really did not like it, mostly because there is a major plot point in the story where the female main character lies to the male love interest about her status of being on birth control. And I really, really, really don't like that kind of trope in romance. Same thing with like cheating or anything like that. I really don't enjoy it. So I definitely took a lot of stars off for that. But it basically covers this girl, Mariah, and she's a human and she can't get pregnant. So she goes to this werewolf fertility clinic and she meets Lowell, who is basically like her donor. And then they end up getting into a relationship through that process. And she ends up lying to Lowell about being on birth control, and that kind of extends their relationship a little bit because he thinks that the fertility treatments are not working, but in reality she's on birth control. And I really did not enjoy that. I don't enjoy like overt deceit in a relationship. So that's why I gave it 1.5 stars. So that's one of my lower rated reads of the year. So in May, I think I read 9 books as well. My favorite book in May that I read was called The Place of Tides by James Rebanks. It was not the highest rated book of the month, but it was my favorite book. I gave it 4.5 stars because the pacing was a little whack. I felt like the story was very front heavy, where you had a lot of detail and a lot of interest in the beginning, like the front part of the story. And then as the story progressed and his time on the island progressed, you ended up losing a lot of momentum in the story. It follows the author, James Rebanks, as he lives and works alongside a traditional duck woman on a remote island in Norway. And what the duck women would do is create nests for eider ducks, and then they would collect the down that was left behind at the end of the nesting season. So the book follows them constructing all of these nests, maintaining their relationship with the eider ducks, and then collecting the down and then leaving the island for the season. I really loved the way that Rebanks narrates this dyeing craft that's really an ancient craft that has persisted into the 21st century. It gives me a lot of hope for the future to know that there are people in the world who are still pursuing crafts and careers that are definitely not going to be around for much longer due to climate change and industrialization. And I think about this book constantly. So if this is another good entry point into narrative writing, James Rebanks has a couple other books. One of them is Pastoral Song, and that's also on my TBR. And that book kind of details him living on his farm in the UK. So I've not heard a lot about this book in the United States. I think that the UK kind of has a bigger market for nature writing based on what I saw in bookstores from when I was there last year. And so I'm really looking for a used copy of The Place of Tides to add to my library because I really want to read it again. I enjoyed it that much. The worst book of May was definitely Anathema by Carrie Lake. I heard a lot of really good things about this, but I think that's partly because Carrie Lake has a kind of cult following. She has another book called Nocticadia, which is a dark academia romance, and I definitely enjoyed Nocticadia a lot more than I enjoyed Anathema. Anathema was entertaining. It was about 20 hours long. I listened to it while I worked on a quilting craft that I have going on right now. But I thought that the pacing was way off and the spicy scenes were kind of cringe. We spent about 20% of the book with the male love interest and the female love interest being separate, and then they finally get together while he's like about to kill her or something. I thought that that was kind of a bad choice. I usually like my MMC and FMC to meet like really quickly, even if they don't like each other or don't spend a lot of time together. I think that just allows more time for the relationship to develop. When they finally got together, the romance kind of felt very rushed and incomplete, and that's because as soon as he lays eyes on her, he figures out that she's his mate or whatever. And I really love mate narratives. I enjoyed Bride. I haven't read Mate by Ali Hazelwood, but it's on my list. And that's because I really like the idea of being mates, but I also like I really enjoy like an initial resistance to that bond, or one of the characters insists on like actually building a relationship out before pursuing anything in terms of their mate bond. In this book, I felt like he really just focused on being obsessed with her, and she was kind of clueless because he didn't tell her that she was his mate. So it was very much like insta love finally when they all got together and figured everything out. I also really thought that some of the spice was really like not enjoyable for me, and I'm not necessarily going to go into why, but it was just not good. So that's why Anathema received 2.5 stars. It definitely gained a star for being so entertaining because my wife and I kind of clowned on it the whole time that we were listening to it, but I'm not really interested in reading the second book, which is Eldritch. So in June, I was part of the Amazing Readathon. I was on Team Alon-Z, and my 5-star reads from that experience were The Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington. That book was absolutely incredible. It was the first time that I went back to epic fantasy since reading The Wheel of Time and getting bogged down in book 8 like 2 years ago. But I really loved the intricate world building, the pacing, and the main characters that we decided to focus on. The magic system is uncomplicated, but it's very believable. It was easy for me to understand. It definitely was easier to understand than the magic systems and the politics in Wheel of Time. In The Shadow of What Was Lost, everyone who has magic has essence, and there was this kind of war, and so the people who can access essence are now kind of an oppressed class, and our main character has access to essence but can't use it for some reason, and he finds out that's because he's a special kind of magic user called an augur. He finds out he's an augur, which is like a persecuted class. They try to kill augurs, and so he ends up escaping, finding other augurs, and there's this war. So there's a good mix of there was a lot of travel in the first book, but there was also a lot of battle scenes towards the end in the climax, and I really enjoyed all of the whole pacing of the book. I felt like the pacing was very steady, and it was also kind of a page turner, even though it was almost 700 pages long. So I very much enjoyed The Shadow of What Was Lost. My second 5-star read was Dungeon Crawler Carl by Matt Dinniman. I picked it up because I had been hearing about it. My wife said that I would probably be interested in it, and then a friend of mine who I really trust his opinion told me that I had to start reading it. So I picked it up. I read the first book in I think like 2 days, and then I read the second book and the third book, and now I'm halfway through the fourth book. And I've really enjoyed my whole time with Dungeon Crawler Carl. I think that the anti-capitalist themes are probably my favorite part of the novels. And I also think it's pretty funny. Books don't usually make me laugh out loud, but Dungeon Crawler Carl does. And so I highly recommend that, especially if you haven't read a lot of RPG literature, which is a genre that I've never heard about. I really enjoyed it. And it was fast paced, and there were a lot of nods to Dungeons and Dragons and also RPG video games. And I just think the whole thing is a really fun ride. So if you haven't read it yet, you should jump on the bandwagon. Then my worst book of June was Guild and its sequel, Glint. If I could give a book 0 stars, I would give this book 0 stars. I only got through it because I was using it for a prompt for the Amazing Readathon, and I didn't want to DNF it because it had so many points attached to it. It was the most tedious and boring book I've read this year. It was not good. The main character, Arin, you find out later that she's half fae, spoiler, but she has she's gold. It's a retelling of Midas's story, and she is gold touched, which means that she is basically, I think, except for the whites of her eyes and her teeth, she is gold all over. So Midas touched her with his powers and she turned gold. And I think her brain turned gold too, because she's also an idiot. And there's this one scene where they're traveling and she's made of gold. So her whole body and personhood is very valuable as a form of currency, which grosses me out. I think there's also a lot of misogyny and patriarchy in this book that's not really addressed or kind of pushed against too much. And that's another reason why I didn't like it. But in this scene, she is explicitly told to stay inside the carriage because they're going through this poor and violent part of town. And she sees some child over there and feels bad for the child. So she gets up and she gets out of the carriage and she goes and starts giving out money to this child and the children who come out of the woodwork to receive money. And then she basically incites mob violence through her presence in the town. And that was probably about 60% of the way through the book. I thought that maybe she would get a little smarter, but she doesn't get smarter. And her agency throughout the book is very minimal, which is something that gets on my nerves. At the beginning, she's kept in a cage. And then what gets her out of the cage is King Midas's decision, not hers. And then at the end, the climax of the book is not even related to anything that's been going on in the plot. They're just randomly attacked by some people. You find out later that the people had information that they would be there, but they were, at the time, it felt random. So yeah, I really didn't enjoy Glint. And then I tried reading Guild to see if she would get any smarter, and she didn't. So really, I did end up DNFing Glint. Glint is when you finally meet the male love interest. And as I stated earlier, I complained when it took 20% of the book for the love interests to meet. And so I really did not tolerate very well having to wait an entire book before meeting our male love interest. I ended up DNFing because it was extremely slow. They were in this camp and they were in that camp for at least 40% of the novel, doing nothing and going nowhere. And so I really did not enjoy that. And I ended up DNFing Glint. So that would definitely be my worst read of 2026 so far. So what have been your best and worst reads of 2026? So I am so excited. I think I've got a lot more good reads coming my way. I have 5 books that I'm currently reading right now, including Pride and Prejudice, which will be the star of an upcoming video. So I'm really excited to get through the rest of this year and reading more, especially as part of Herkiad 3.0. So if you enjoyed this video, remember to like, and if you want to see more of me, you can subscribe, and let me know what you thought in the comments, especially if you have any feedback, considering this is only my second video. I finally got a microphone, so I'm hoping that the audio quality will be greatly improved. But if you have any other feedback, let me know, because I am definitely looking to improve. So I'll see you in the next one. Bye.